The silence didn't arrive gently. It slammed into the studio like a power outage. 1 second, the air hummed with forced politeness and camera-ready smiles. The next, a chair scraped back, a microphone hung unanswered, and every red recording light suddenly felt accusatory. Meghan Markle was no longer sitting across from Piers Morgan. She was walking away. Live. Unscripted. Unmistakable. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Not the host. Not the crew. Not the audience frozen behind their polite claps and gasps. Studio lights burned hot and unforgiving, bleaching color from faces that had not rehearsed this outcome. The control room waited for a cue that never came. There was no commercial break. No graceful fade out. Just absence, hanging where a global icon had been moments earlier. This wasn't a dramatic flourish. It didn't feel strategic. It felt raw. Sudden. Like a breaking point reached not in private, but under the glare of millions of watching eyes. The kind of moment producers pray never happens, and viewers never forget. A rupture so sharp it slices straight through the illusion of control that live television is built on. Because walk-offs don't happen like this. Not from figures this managed. Not on platforms this exposed. Meghan Markle, a woman whose public image has been shaped, shielded, and carefully narrated for years, didn't exit with a final line or a defiant speech. She left behind silence. And silence, in moments like this, is louder than any accusation. Piers Morgan remained seated, his expression caught somewhere between composure and calculation. The camera lingered just long enough to make it uncomfortable. Too long to pretend nothing had happened. Too short to explain it. The audience at home leaned closer, sensing instinctively that they had just witnessed something irreversible. Viewers sensed history cracking open, the fragile contract between celebrity power and public accountability snapping, exposing how thin the line is between command of narrative and sudden, irreversible vulnerability in real time for watching. Social media would later argue about what it meant. Supporters would call it self-protection. Critics would call it collapse. But in that exact moment, none of those narratives existed yet. There was only one undeniable fact: something had gone off script, and no one in the room knew who had lost control first. And that question, why Meghan walked off, and who truly broke under pressure, would ignite debates far beyond that studio. But to understand how this moment detonated on live television, we have to rewind to the tension that had been building for years. From the moment the interview was announced, it carried the weight of inevitability. This was never just another celebrity sit-down, never a soft-focus conversation designed to polish reputations. It landed at the intersection of culture, politics, media power, and identity, where every sentence would be interpreted as a signal, every pause as a confession. Supporters circled the date with anticipation. Critics sharpened their knives. Everyone knew something would happen. No one knew how explosive it would be. Piers Morgan did not arrive at this moment by accident. For decades, he had cultivated a reputation as the interviewer who refused to blink. He challenged sacred cows, punctured carefully crafted narratives, and asked the questions others were warned not to touch. To his supporters, he was one of the last voices willing to confront power without apology. To his critics, he was abrasive, ego-driven, and dangerously dismissive of lived experience. But both sides agreed on one thing: he could not be controlled once the cameras rolled. Meghan Markle, by contrast, represented something far larger than herself. To millions, she symbolized modern progress, a biracial woman who disrupted centuries of tradition and paid a public price for it. She was admired for her confidence, defended as a target of cruelty, and embraced as proof that institutions could be challenged from within. At the same time, she was scrutinized relentlessly, accused of manipulation, contradiction, and weaponizing victimhood. She existed at the center of cultural gravity, where praise and resentment collided daily. That combination alone made this interview combustible. An unapologetic interrogator facing a figure whose identity had become a cultural battleground. One man who built his career on pressure. One woman who had learned to survive by controlling narrative. This was not a meeting of equals. It was a collision of philosophies about power itself. The political undertones were impossible to ignore. Conversations about race, privilege, monarchy, media accountability, and public trust hovered invisibly over the studio long before the cameras turned on. Every answer would be dissected. Every challenge would be framed as either courage or cruelty, depending on who was watching. This was not entertainment. It was a proxy war for deeper anxieties simmering across societies already divided. That is why the announcement alone sent shockwaves through social media. Comment sections became battlegrounds. Hashtags formed before a single word was spoken. Viewers chose sides early, aligning themselves with dignity or defiance, empathy or skepticism. The interview had not even begun, yet the verdicts were already being drafted. Producers could sense it. Audiences could feel it. This was the kind of television that teetered on the edge of control, where a single unscripted moment could collapse months of planning. Everyone tuned in expecting sparks, sharp exchanges, maybe a viral clip or two. It mattered because this was not just about manners or tone. It was about who gets to ask questions, who is expected to absorb discomfort, and who is allowed to retreat when narratives fracture. For progressive viewers, the stakes felt existential, tied to dignity, representation, and the right to be heard without humiliation. For skeptics, it was a long-awaited test of accountability, a chance to see polished storytelling collide with resistance. Each side projected its hopes onto the screen, searching for confirmation, validation, or collapse. The studio became a symbolic arena, carrying years of unresolved tension about voice, power, and credibility, compressing them into a single hour that promised confrontation, consequence, and a moment no one could fully predict. Every expectation pressed inward, tightening the atmosphere until even silence felt charged with impending consequence for everyone watching worldwide. Few realized they were about to witness something far more personal, far more revealing, and far more destabilizing than anyone had prepared for. Piers Morgan did not need to raise his voice to dominate a room. His power came from something quieter and more unsettling, the certainty that he would not retreat. For decades, he had built a career on confrontation, not as chaos, but as method. He believed journalism was not meant to comfort the powerful or protect carefully curated images. It was meant to test them. And when he sat across from someone, he made it clear that reputation, status, and public sympathy would not buy insulation from scrutiny. To his critics, that posture looked like arrogance masquerading as principle. They accused him of cruelty disguised as candor, of mistaking provocation for truth. They argued that his questions often crossed from accountability into antagonism, especially when aimed at women, minorities, or figures framed as victims of institutional harm. In their eyes, Morgan wasn't brave. He was reckless, a man who confused being loud with being right, who thrived on outrage more than understanding. But to his supporters, that same posture was precisely the point. They saw him as one of the last interviewers unwilling to bow to emotional pressure or online mobs. A man who asked what others were too afraid to ask. Someone who believed that power, once shielded by sentiment, became untouchable. They admired his refusal to soften language for applause, his insistence that difficult questions were not acts of violence but obligations of public service. What made Morgan particularly polarizing was not just what he asked, but how calmly he asked it. He rarely exploded. He did not need theatrics. His tone remained measured, even polite, as he pressed forward. That calmness unsettled guests far more than shouting ever could. It forced them to confront the substance of the question without the distraction of obvious hostility. And when answers drifted, when narratives bent, he circled back patiently, unrelenting. This approach earned him a reputation as someone who never backs down once challenged. Pushback did not intimidate him. Emotional appeals did not derail him. Attempts to reframe questions as personal attacks often only encouraged him to lean in further. He treated resistance not as a signal to retreat, but as confirmation that he had struck something real. Yet this same trait fed accusations that his journalism was driven by ego as much as ethics. Detractors claimed he enjoyed the spectacle of dominance, that his confrontations were performances designed to center himself as the story. They pointed to moments where interviews became less about uncovering truth and more about asserting control. In their view, Morgan blurred the line between public accountability and personal vendetta. The contradiction sat at the heart of his persona. Was he a necessary disruptor in a media landscape addicted to politeness? Or a provocateur whose confidence eclipsed empathy? The answer depended entirely on who was watching. And that division followed him into every studio he entered. By the time he sat across from Meghan Markle, Morgan carried all of that baggage with him. Every past clash, every viral exchange, every accusation and defense hung invisibly in the air. Viewers knew his playbook. They knew he would not cushion questions out of respect for titles or trauma. They also knew that once he sensed evasion, he would apply pressure with surgical patience. That knowledge alone raised the tension before a single word was spoken. This was not an interviewer seeking validation. It was a man prepared to test boundaries. Aware that doing so would inflame critics and energize supporters in equal measure. Calm on the surface, confrontational at the core, Piers Morgan walked into that studio armed with questions sharpened by years of conflict, ready to hold his ground no matter the backlash. But if Piers was walking into this encounter armed with questions, Meghan was walking in carrying something far heavier. Meghan Markle did not walk into that studio as just a guest. She arrived carrying the accumulated weight of every chapter that came before her, each one rewritten and debated in public. Long before royalty, she was an actress navigating Hollywood's quiet hierarchies, learning early how perception could open doors or close them without explanation. She learned how to speak with intention, how to present confidence without apology, how to survive spaces that rewarded likability while punishing deviation. That education never left her. Then came the fairy tale, the royal wedding that felt to many like history bending. For supporters, she represented progress made visible, a woman who reflected a future Britain claimed it wanted. For critics, she symbolized disruption, an outsider who never truly fit the script. Inside the palace, tradition and expectation tightened. Outside, commentary intensified. Every gesture became symbolic. Every silence became suspicious. Admiration and hostility chased her in equal measure. When the exit came, it was framed as exile and escape at the same time. Meghan and Harry's departure from royal life transformed her into something new entirely, a global figure untethered from institution, yet defined by it. She reinvented herself not quietly, but deliberately. Podcasts, interviews, curated appearances on friendly platforms where empathy was guaranteed and the ground felt safe. She spoke of mental health, isolation, and racial hostility, narratives that resonated deeply with progressive audiences who saw their own struggles reflected back at them. But with that resonance came relentless scrutiny. For every person who saw courage, another saw calculation. Critics accused her of contradiction, of selectively revealing pain while avoiding accountability. Supporters countered that trauma does not require permission to be valid. The debate hardened into camps, each convinced the other was willfully blind. Meghan became less a person and more a symbol, her identity contested terrain in a culture war she did not fully control. What mattered most was how she learned to navigate that reality. Meghan became accustomed to environments where her story was not interrogated but received. Interviews framed her experiences as truth, not claims to be tested. Hosts nodded, affirmed, and validated. The focus remained on her emotional reality, not factual cross-examination. In those spaces, vulnerability functioned as armor, a shield that discouraged pushback by redefining challenge as harm. That strategy worked because it aligned with a broader cultural shift. Audiences increasingly valued lived experience over adversarial debate. Questioning someone's narrative could be framed as cruelty. Empathy became currency, and Meghan wielded it skillfully. She spoke in a language of impact rather than detail, of feeling rather than sequence. For supporters, that made her brave. For skeptics, it made her slippery. Yet beneath the confidence, there was undeniable sensitivity. Years of criticism had sharpened her awareness of tone, implication, and subtext. She knew how quickly public sentiment could turn. She understood that one poorly framed moment could be weaponized endlessly. Control was not vanity. It was survival. And control meant choosing platforms carefully, avoiding spaces where narratives could fracture under pressure. That is what made this interview different. This was not a sanctuary. It was not designed to protect her story from friction. The format itself implied challenge, and challenge threatened the architecture she had built around her public identity. Sympathy-driven storytelling thrives on alignment, not opposition. It requires an audience prepared to listen, not interrogate. Meghan entered the studio aware of the risk, yet confident in the armor she had worn before. She had survived tabloids, institutions, and exile. She had turned pain into purpose, criticism into brand. But live television strips away buffers. It removes the safety of editing, the comfort of agreement. It exposes not just what is said, but how it is said under pressure. Which is why, when the first uncomfortable question landed, the temperature in the studio changed instantly. The interview began the way so many high-stakes encounters do, wrapped in courtesy that felt just a little too tight. Smiles appeared on cue. Introductions were smooth, almost ceremonial. The words were polite, but the air between them was tense, stretched thin by everything both sides knew but had not yet said. Meghan spoke with practiced warmth, her answers flowing in familiar rhythms. Piers listened, nodding, his posture relaxed, his voice measured, as though this were any other conversation. At first, the questions stayed safely above the surface. They touched on purpose, advocacy, the language of resilience that audiences had come to expect. Meghan responded confidently, choosing phrases that emphasized intention over detail, emotion over chronology. The audience responded with approving murmurs, reassured that the tone remained respectful. Yet beneath that calm, something uneasy lingered. Each pause felt slightly longer than necessary. Each transition felt deliberate, as if both participants were feeling for the edge. Then the questions began to sharpen. Subtle at first. A request for clarification. A gentle follow-up that nudged an answer back toward specifics. Piers did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He simply asked again, reframing the same point from a different angle. The shift was almost imperceptible, but the effect was immediate. Meghan's cadence slowed. Her smile flickered, recalibrated, returned with effort rather than ease. The camera caught it all. A brief tightening around her eyes. A hand adjusting in her lap. A breath taken just a beat too late. The audience sensed it too, responding with nervous laughter that landed awkwardly in the space between question and answer. Piers remained still, composed, waiting. Silence stretched, no longer comfortable, but charged, demanding resolution. Interruptions crept in, not as interruptions in volume, but in timing. Piers gently stepped into pauses Meghan might once have filled herself. He circled back to points she tried to leave behind. Each return narrowed the space for abstraction. The conversation, once broad and affirming, began to feel confined. Meghan's answers grew more careful, more defensive, layered with qualifiers. Her voice remained controlled, but the confidence beneath it wavered. The contrast was striking. Piers appeared almost serene, anchored by the certainty of his approach. He leaned forward slightly, attentive, unhurried. Meghan leaned back, then forward again, as if testing where safety still existed. Her tone sharpened at the edges. Humor disappeared. What had begun as collaboration shifted toward negotiation, then toward resistance. Awkward silences punctuated the exchange. Moments where the audience wasn't sure whether to react at all. The cameras cut between faces, catching raised eyebrows, parted lips, the subtle choreography of discomfort. Each cut heightened the sense that something fragile was being pressed too hard. Meghan's words began to circle familiar ground, returning to themes of impact and feeling, while the questions demanded something else entirely. It became clear that the interview was no longer moving along agreed paths. Meghan's narrative armor, so effective in friendly spaces, struggled under sustained focus. Piers' calm persistence functioned like pressure, not explosive, but constant. The imbalance grew visible. What one side experienced as accountability, the other experienced as threat. The audience felt it instinctively. This was the moment when politeness stopped protecting anyone. When every response carried consequence. When the room itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for either release or rupture. Meghan paused longer now, choosing words with visible care, her composure intact but strained. Piers framed it without aggression, but the implication landed heavily. It asked not just what had been felt, but what could be demonstrated. It asked whether memory alone was enough, whether emotion could stand without evidence. Meghan's eyes lifted briefly toward the lights, then back again, as if searching for footing. A murmur rippled through the audience, uncertainty replacing reassurance. In that space, the power dynamic shifted unmistakably, and the comfort of rehearsed answers began to dissolve. The pause that followed felt heavier than anything spoken, a pause filled with calculation, risk, and the awareness of millions watching. Meghan inhaled slowly, aware that whatever came next would echo far beyond the studio walls. Time seemed to compress, narrowing outcomes. Suddenly. And then came the question that no one had prepared for, not even Meghan. The question landed like a lightning bolt. Not loud, not theatrical, but precise, unavoidable. Piers Morgan's voice remained calm, almost conversational, yet every word carried weight. You've said that before, but the timelines don't quite align. How do you respond to that? For a fraction of a second, Meghan's eyes flicked toward the cameras, then back to him, a subtle acknowledgement of the stakes she now faced. The air thickened. The studio, already taut, seemed to shrink. Her first response was careful. Measured. She reframed. Softened, tried to redirect toward broader intentions. Her voice, practiced and confident in rehearsed spaces, wavered just enough to reveal the first crack. Piers did not rush, did not interject. He allowed the pause, letting the silence press in, like a weight pressing on both the studio and the millions watching from home. The cameras lingered. The audience sensed the tension immediately, leaning forward, murmurs spreading quietly among them. Even the crew exchanged glances, unsure if they should intervene or simply capture the moment as it unfolded. When she tried to pivot, offering a more general answer, Piers circled back. He pointed to inconsistencies, to public statements she had made. To moments already recorded and circulated online. Each citation was delivered without mockery, without anger, yet it landed like a series of small, surgical strikes. The precision of his questioning made it impossible to hide behind charm or eloquence. It was not meant to humiliate, not directly, but humiliation crept in anyway because the stakes were global, and because millions were watching to see a figure of power pressed in real time. Meghan's responses shifted from deflection to defensiveness. Her tone hardened subtly. Words came faster, sometimes overlapping her composure with frustration she had rarely allowed to surface publicly. There was a rhythm to the confrontation, assertion followed by challenge, explanation followed by counterpoint, a back and forth that escalated in tension even as the surface calm persisted. Each beat of the exchange revealed a tension that had been simmering for years, expectations unmet, narratives contested, identity scrutinized, and now it boiled in full view. The power dynamic began to flicker. For the first time in the interview, control did not feel solely hers. Her carefully constructed narrative, so reliable in friendly spaces, met a persistent, unyielding counterforce. Piers, seated with minimal movement, almost invisible in his composure, subtly guided the interaction, emphasizing gaps and inconsistencies while allowing her space to respond. Meghan's usual armor of carefully framed empathy strained under the pressure, small tells betraying her concentration, a tightening of the jaw, a subtle hand gesture, a flicker in her eyes that had not been there before. The audience at home could feel it. Social media lit up in real time. Clips of the exchanges began circulating instantly, hashtags, memes, and hot takes erupted as viewers debated who was winning and who was losing. Some saw Meghan defending herself against relentless scrutiny. Others saw the cracks widening under the pressure. Moments of hesitation and subtle faltering amplified into perceived defeat. The room in the studio held a similar energy, a combination of fascination, anxiety, and disbelief that a controlled television interview could transform into something unpredictable so quickly. The exchange deepened. Piers pressed harder, his questions transitioning from timeline inconsistencies to principle and accountability. Each query was phrased in calm, almost measured language, but the effect was cumulative. It was relentless yet dignified, the kind of questioning that exposes gaps not by aggression but by patience. Meghan attempted to recover, repeating points she had used in earlier interviews, yet repetition alone could not regain the upper hand. Her voice carried the weight of experience, of self-protection, of narratives carefully honed over years, but the structure of the questioning revealed limitations she had not anticipated. At one moment, her attempt at humor, a strategy she often used to diffuse tension, landed awkwardly. The audience laughed uneasily, unsure whether to empathize or mock. The cameras cut between her expression and Piers' calm gaze, capturing the subtle imbalance. Each reaction, each pause, each hesitation was magnified in real time, not just in the studio, but across feeds, screens, and living rooms worldwide. It was the slow unraveling of a duel fought in words, tone, and timing, the kind of confrontation that leaves everyone watching simultaneously engaged and unsettled. Even subtle gestures became magnified. A hand moving across the table. A slight shift in posture. The way Meghan's eyes darted, if only for a fraction of a second, away from the interviewer. These tiny moments, often invisible in ordinary conversation, now served as signals, amplifying tension for those attuned to the theater of live performance. Every nuance was noted by commentators, fans, and critics alike. A pause that might once have passed unnoticed now became a viral talking point. Evidence in the court of public opinion. As the exchange continued, the emotional landscape became increasingly layered. Piers' calm persistence contrasted starkly with Meghan's rising defensiveness. The room, the cameras, the audience, both live and virtual, sensed a power struggle that was no longer subtle. Her control over the narrative was slipping, not entirely lost, but destabilized. And with each beat, the friction escalated, pushing both participants toward a critical juncture that neither could fully anticipate. Even supporters watching were unsettled. They admired her poise, her intelligence, her ability to defend herself under relentless scrutiny, but there was no denying the pressure, no denying that this moment felt precarious, exposed, and profoundly human. This was more than performance, it was confrontation distilled into its rawest form, evidence, argument, emotion, and identity colliding under the unflinching gaze of millions. And then, the conversation reached the apex of tension. Words that had been avoided, questions that had been circling silently, all converged. The room felt smaller. Time slowed. Each syllable carried more weight than the last. It was no longer just a clash of narratives. It was a test of composure. Of resilience, of who would maintain presence of mind and who would falter under the relentless spotlight. What happened next wasn't just uncomfortable. It was unprecedented. And then it happened. The moment that no one expected but everyone had anticipated. Meghan Markle, seated just moments before with carefully measured composure, stood. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, as if testing the gravity of what she was about to do. And then, with the deliberate weight of a decision fully realized, she began to walk away. Not abruptly, not theatrically, but with a quiet finality that made the studio itself seem to pause. Every eye followed her movement, every microphone captured the absence of her voice. Every camera held on a space suddenly hollowed by tension. Piers Morgan, seated across from her, blinked once, twice, his expression caught in the fragile boundary between shock and calculation. His jaw did not tighten, and his voice did not rise. He simply remained where he was, the calm eye in a storm of disbelief. For a heartbeat, the audience thought perhaps this was a pause, a stage-managed interlude, a momentary lapse before resuming. But the weight of her retreat made that impossible. This was not planned. This was not a performance designed for viral impact. This was something far more elemental. The crew froze. Cameras lingered awkwardly, operators unsure whether to follow, cut, or hold. Teleprompters and monitors felt suddenly irrelevant, unable to structure what was happening. The air in the studio thickened with the collective gasp of everyone present, the kind of collective intake of breath that only occurs when the ordinary rules of expectation are broken. There was no guidebook for this. There was only reaction, stunned, raw, human. For the audience watching at home, the effect was immediate and profound. Secondhand embarrassment mixed with exhilaration. Clips that would later circulate endlessly captured her slow departure. A combination of dignity and defiance that invited interpretation. Was this retreat? A protest? A collapse under pressure? Every viewer was forced to supply their own answer, projecting hope, disappointment, or judgment onto the silent space she left behind. Critics, of course, were quick to seize their narratives. Vindication was immediate. Here was a figure long accused of evasion, retreating under scrutiny, unable to answer questions that had demanded clarity. To some, it confirmed preconceptions, a carefully curated image cracking under the pressure of unfiltered confrontation. The headlines themselves seemed to pivot mid-sentence, walk off, meltdown, unprecedented, each one capturing the collective shock in just a few words. Supporters, conversely, felt a pang of betrayal. The woman who had been framed as resilient, who had transformed public scrutiny into advocacy, had suddenly chosen absence. They questioned whether the choice to leave represented surrender, self-preservation, or a calculated statement too subtle for immediate comprehension. Loyalty felt tested, admiration mingled with confusion. Yet even in their disappointment, there was recognition. She had taken control of the moment in the only way left. To her. Silence, after all, can be as deliberate a tool as words. The walk-off carried symbolic weight that transcended the studio walls. Every frame of her exit suggested multiple truths simultaneously. Retreat could be resistance. Collapse could be courage under scrutiny. Withdrawal could be a statement of self-preservation. And in that ambiguity lay the power of the moment. It refused to be simplified, refused to fit neatly into the categories critics and supporters alike wanted to assign. The narrative splintered as quickly as the cameras captured it. The energy in the room shifted after she left. Piers remained seated, the calm anchor in a sea of uncertainty. Crew members whispered. Some frozen mid-task, the tension palpable in every gesture. The audience, both live and remote, felt the reverberation immediately. Something monumental had occurred, a rupture in the expected flow of television that none could ignore. Every reaction carried weight, amplified in real time by social media, by conversation, by collective astonishment. And yet, for all the shock contained within the studio, it was only the first wave. The silence, the pause, the image of Meghan walking away, it held a quiet power, a stillness that spoke louder than any words exchanged. It forced reflection, debate, and speculation. It forced everyone present to consider what agency really looked like when every expectation was stacked against you. But the real explosion didn't happen in the studio. It happened online. The moment the cameras cut away, the studio's stillness gave way to a storm that stretched far beyond the walls. Within seconds, clips of Meghan's exit were circulating online, hashtags igniting like wildfire. Hashtag walk off, hashtag Meghan vs. Piers, hashtag Live Meltdown, millions watched, shared, and debated, each interpretation competing for dominance. The digital landscape erupted in a cascade of reactions, memes, and think pieces, each one reframing the moment according to ideology, allegiance, or appetite for spectacle. Social media became the arena for interpretation, and the rules were clear, context was optional, judgment instantaneous. Supporters defended her courage, framing the walk-off as an act of self-preservation against relentless interrogation. Critics pounced, portraying it as evidence of evasion, weakness, or entitlement. Even neutral observers struggled to keep pace with the torrent of clips, GIFs, and commentary dissecting posture, tone, and expression frame by frame. Within minutes, it was impossible to separate the event from the swirling interpretations it had provoked. Media outlets instantly took sides, some lauding Meghan for standing her ground, others condemning her for abandoning decorum. Headlines screamed across platforms: Royal walk-off shock studio, Duchess retreats under pressure, a lesson in media accountability. Every narrative was amplified, every angle critiqued, every assertion tested against social media chatter. The story became less about what happened in that room and more about what it represented, a cultural Rorschach test. Viewers projected fears, aspirations, and biases onto the footage, each perception revealing more about the audience than the act itself. Influencers, commentators, and journalists debated in real time. Clips went viral within minutes. Short clips highlighting Meghan's hesitation, her glance at the cameras, her deliberate steps away from the desk, were looped endlessly. Analysts dissected her tone, dissected Piers' composure, dissected the subtle power dynamics at play. Clips became reaction fodder. Live streams ran commentary, some supportive, others scathing, all feeding the same frenzy. Millions watched, paused, replayed, and shared, creating feedback loops that intensified the narrative and magnified the emotional stakes. For progressive audiences, the moment reinforced ongoing conversations about power, race, gender, and media treatment. Many saw validation in Meghan asserting agency, refusing to be bullied on live television. Identity and empathy intertwined with outrage, producing commentary that was personal, political, and culturally resonant. For conservative or skeptical viewers, it was a test of accountability, an occasion to critique performance, narrative control, and the perceived fragility of curated public personas. Across feeds, comment threads, and news cycles, agreement was impossible, and division sharpened instantly. Even within the mainstream press, the interpretation splintered. Talk shows debated the ethics of pressing public figures with personal trauma. Editorials argued over whether the moment demonstrated courage or collapse. Podcasts dissected body language and phrasing, replaying subtle gestures that had already become iconic. Every minute amplified the spectacle. The story evolved faster than the original footage, an uncontrollable narrative that shaped itself through millions of eyes and voices. The effect was disorienting, even for casual viewers. What had been an interview transformed into a global performance, a cultural touchstone that prompted reflection, judgment, and realignment. People who had never engaged with the British monarchy or American media discourse found themselves participating, taking sides, or simply marveling at the intensity of the moment. Every clip, every reaction, every post reinforced the notion that this was more than television. It was a collective experience, a shared confrontation with questions of dignity, resilience, and public scrutiny. In the end, the ripple effects extended far beyond social media trends or news cycles. Conversations spilled into homes, workplaces, and online communities worldwide. Memes and hot takes multiplied. Polls and threads erupted. But beneath the noise, one uncomfortable truth began to surface. In the hours and days after the walk-off, the conversation shifted from spectacle to reflection. What had initially felt like chaos revealed itself as a lesson in power and scrutiny, a reminder that public figures operate under a magnifying glass that spares no nuance. Meghan's choice to leave, deliberate and measured, forced a reckoning, sometimes standing your ground is defined not by words alone, but by the courage to preserve dignity when pressure threatens to compromise it. Walking away and standing firm are often framed as opposites, yet in this moment, they coexisted. Leaving the studio did not signal defeat, it signaled awareness of the stakes, of the limits imposed by an unyielding interrogation. Piers Morgan, composed and relentless, represented the pressure of scrutiny that all public figures face. Meghan's exit reminded viewers that power does not always mean control, and control is rarely absolute. The currency of dignity, preserved under pressure, proved far more potent than any immediate victory in argument. The incident also underscored how fragile narrative control truly is. Years of careful strategy, media management, and public positioning can be disrupted in an instant when questions pierce the carefully maintained armor. It illuminated a fundamental truth: authority and influence are not guaranteed by titles, popularity, or reputation. They are maintained through constant engagement, credibility, and the willingness to navigate confrontation without losing self-possession. Silence, in this case, was more than absence. It was a statement, a revelation, and a strategy all at once. Observers began to reassess what had transpired. For some, it was a lesson in accountability, a demonstration that no amount of image crafting shields one from scrutiny. For others, it was an affirmation that integrity includes knowing when to disengage, when preservation of self is more valuable than the fleeting satisfaction of debate. The lines between victory and compromise blurred, leaving a more complex understanding of what power, resilience, and courage truly look like under pressure. In a broader cultural sense, the walk-off reshaped public perception. It reminded audiences that public confrontation is rarely simple, that every response carries layered meaning, and that perception is shaped as much by choice as by circumstance. Social media, news outlets, and everyday viewers were compelled to navigate ambiguity, to interpret intention, and to reflect on their own judgments about authority, respect, and composure. The event became a touchstone for discussions about the human cost of living in a spotlight that never dims, where every decision is amplified and dissected. Ultimately, the moment transcended entertainment. It became a lesson in resilience and moral clarity, demonstrating that courage can manifest as measured action rather than forceful rebuttal, that truth withstands discomfort, and that dignity under scrutiny carries a weight no viral moment can diminish. Control may be fleeting, narratives may fracture, and scrutiny may be relentless, but the strength to act with intention, even in silence, is enduring. And that's why this moment will be remembered long after the cameras stopped rolling. The room fell silent, but the echoes of that walk-off continue to reverberate. Meghan Markle allegedly walking off Piers Morgan's show wasn't just television drama, it became a symbol of what happens when scrutiny meets unyielding pressure, when dignity confronts relentless questioning. The pause said everything, leaving viewers worldwide to wrestle with their own interpretations: courage, protest, or collapse. This moment still matters because it challenges us to think about power, accountability, and the cost of control. It asks each of us to reflect: when faced with intensity, do we assert ourselves, step back, or watch silently? And it reminds us that public perception is never fixed, it shifts with every glance, every word, every choice. We want to hear from you. What did you see in that pause? Which side of the story resonates, and why? Share your thoughts, join the conversation, and witness history unfold with us. Every perspective matters, because this isn't just a moment in media, it's a mirror of how we confront pressure, truth, and the courage to act.